On the morning of February 19th, 1982, first responders arrived at a quiet home in Brighton, New York, a suburban community just outside Rochester. They were responding to a 911 call from a concerned neighbor who had reported there's been, I think, a murder across the street. It was a calm winter morning, but what police would find inside the home would be anything but ordinary. Officer Marcus Spaker, then serving with the Brighton Police Department, was one of the first to reach the scene. He approached the house without knowing exactly what awaited inside, responding to what had been logged as a situation of unknown cause. Upon entering the home, he made his way upstairs and encountered a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, lying in her bed, was 29-year-old Kathy Krauseneck. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared to be peacefully asleep. But the grim reality was quickly evident. An axe was still buried in her head. It was a scene of horrifying violence, made even more shocking by the fact that the weapon remained lodged in place. Officer Spaker later described the moment simply, saying she looked like she was sleeping with an axe buried into her head. There were no immediate signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle were reported at that time. The home was quiet, still, and undisturbed, except for the brutal scene upstairs. For Officer Spaker and others who entered that house, the memory of that day would never fade. The image of Kathy Krauseneck's body and the sheer violence of the crime would become one of the most disturbing memories of their careers. Among the most deeply troubling elements of the Kathy Krauseneck case was the presence of her young daughter, Sarah, inside the home during or after the murder. Just 3 years old at the time, Sarah may have spent hours alone in the house with her mother's body before authorities arrived. The realization of this possibility would weigh heavily on investigators and remain a haunting aspect of the case. Investigator Richard Corrigan later stated that Kathy had likely been dead for more than 8 hours by the time first responders entered the home. This timeline raised the likelihood that Sarah had been left alone in the house for much of the day, unaware of the full extent of what had happened. The chilling detail turned a horrific homicide into a deeply personal and emotional tragedy. Officer Marcus Spaker, one of the first to arrive at the scene, openly reflected on the emotional toll the discovery took on him. While the violent nature of the crime was unforgettable, it was the thought of the small child left in such a traumatic environment that would disturb him for years to come. He admitted to having nightmares about Sarah being alone in the house, underscoring how profoundly the incident affected those involved. In the early stages of the investigation, pressing questions emerged. What had Sarah seen? What might she have understood or remembered? These were concerns that arose immediately, though investigators had no clear answers at the time. Her presence added a heartbreaking layer to an already horrific case, turning a brutal crime scene into a scene of unimaginable isolation and sorrow. The initial police response to the murder of Kathy Krauseneck was swift, but the emotional and psychological impact would be long-lasting. Officer Marcus Spaker, one of the first on the scene, vividly recalled what he saw upon entering the bedroom. She looked like she was sleeping with an axe buried into her head, he said. The disturbing image, frozen in his memory, was unlike anything he had encountered before in his career. The brutality of the crime, a young woman murdered in her own bed, the weapon still embedded in her skull, left investigators stunned. The home itself appeared undisturbed, with no immediate signs of forced entry. Yet upstairs lay a horrifying scene that would stay with the officers who witnessed it for decades. For Spaker, it was not only the violence of the act that haunted him, but also the overwhelming thought that Kathy's 3-year-old daughter may have been in the house with her mother's body for hours. Spaker later admitted to having nightmares about that day. The image of the child, alone and unaware, created a sense of helplessness that cut deeper than the crime scene itself. The case was more than just a murder. It became a deeply emotional experience for those assigned to investigate it. Though the cause of death was obvious, the motive and identity of the killer were not. Investigators had few immediate answers. The lack of resolution, paired with the shocking nature of the crime, cast a long shadow over the department. This uncertainty began to define the investigation, marking the early realization that this would not be a case with quick answers. It was the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward justice. In the months and years following Kathy Krausenek's murder, investigators were unable to make significant progress. Despite the brutality of the crime and the emotional toll it took on everyone involved, the case eventually began to stall. There were no immediate arrests, and no clear suspect emerged. The crime scene had offered little in the way of answers, and crucial questions remained. Who would want Kathy dead, and why? As time passed, the investigation lost momentum. Leads dried up. Evidence, if any existed, failed to yield results. The passage of years only deepened the mystery, and the case was eventually classified as a cold case. For Kathy's family, including her young daughter Sarah, this lack of resolution left an open wound. There was no closure, no justice, and no understanding of what had taken place that February morning in Brighton. The presence of 3-year-old Sarah in the home at the time of the murder continued to cast a long shadow over the case. What she might have witnessed or remembered became a matter of public interest and private concern. Yet, no official statement or insight into her recollections has been provided, and the script remains grounded in only what is confirmed. Speculation is left unspoken. In a preview of the Dateline episode, correspondent Andrea Canning captured the emotional weight that lingered. What had she seen? What did she know? Questions that would hang over this family, this entire town, longer than anyone could have imagined. The unresolved nature of the crime and the silence that followed turned the case into one of those long unsolved mysteries that never quite faded. It remained a haunting presence in Brighton, waiting for answers that would not come for decades. Nearly 40 years after the brutal murder of Kathy Krausenek, a new investigative team revisited the case. According to the synopsis from Dateline, modern investigators reopened the long cold file, seeking answers in a crime that had haunted the community of Brighton for decades. Though time had passed, interest in the case never fully disappeared. The disturbing nature of the crime, a woman murdered in her own bed with her young child nearby, continued to raise concerns, both publicly and within law enforcement. The fact that no resolution had been reached only intensified the need for a fresh look. With advancements in investigative practices and a renewed sense of determination, the new team set out to uncover the truth. While the background information does not provide specifics on the steps taken or the evidence uncovered, it does confirm that these efforts led to a major development. A suspect was ultimately convicted in Kathy Krausenek's murder. This marked a significant turning point in a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades. As part of its coverage, Dateline included interviews with key figures connected to the renewed investigation. Kathy's sister, Annette Schlosser, and Monroe County District Attorney Sandra Dorley were both featured in the episode, offering insight into the emotional and legal dimensions of the case's re-examination. Their appearances underscore the lasting impact of the crime and the importance of continuing efforts to seek justice, even decades later. For nearly 4 decades, the brutal murder of Kathleen Krausenek remained one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Brighton, New York. But justice, though delayed, eventually found its way. In 2019, a fresh look at the evidence led to a major breakthrough. Investigators re-examined the timeline of events and found that Jim Krausenek's account of the day Kathy died was filled with inconsistencies. Experts testified that the window he claimed the killer used to enter the home had been broken from the inside. Moreover, the timeline revealed it was almost impossible for someone to break in, murder Kathy with an axe, and escape undetected within the short time Jim claimed to have been away from the house. In 2022, more than 40 years after Kathy was killed, her husband, James Krausenek, was found guilty of second-degree murder. The trial included testimony from forensic experts, law enforcement officers, and even Kathy's family members. The prosecution argued successfully that Jim had murdered Kathy while their daughter was asleep in the next room, a shocking betrayal masked for decades behind a clean-cut facade. On November 7, 2022, Jim was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The courtroom was filled with emotional testimony, from Kathy's surviving family to Sarah, their daughter, who was just 3 years old at the time of the murder. Some supported Jim, believing he was innocent. Others felt deep relief that the truth had finally come to light. However, the story did not end there. In 2023, Jim died in prison while his legal team was still pursuing an appeal to overturn the conviction. His death left unanswered questions, but for many, it marked the final chapter in a case that had haunted them for decades. Justice, though imperfect, had finally been served.